Hello, everybody, to our guest speaker series. Um, welcome. So we're going to start with the traditional land acknowledgement. Lois is going to lead.
Sure, thanks, Megan, and hello, everyone. Hope you and your loved ones are doing well on this second day of spring. I didn't realize that yesterday was the day, but here we are in spring. And yeah, it's windy over here. So we would like to start this event by acknowledging the land where the University of Toronto operates, and to also invite anyone who's not in Toronto at the moment to reflect similarly from within your own space. So the land that Toronto or Tkaronto sits upon has a long and tangled history that carries the storied footprints of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe nations who have sought to walk gently on this land. They offered assistance to the first European travelers to this territory and shared their knowledge for survival. Tkaronto has a treaty with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and is also part of the Dish with One Spoon agreement to share the land between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee nations. We acknowledge the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit peoples. And in moving towards reconciliation, we seek to polish the Silver Covenant chain and a restoration of the relationship between the Onkwe-Honwe original and settler peoples of this land, one that's based in honor and in deep respect. Land acknowledgements, of course, continue to be sites of resistance and socio-political contestation, and they serve as a starting point, like a very small representation, the very beginning of work for the truth and reconciliation. But importantly, they do need to be taken beyond like just reciting them. So land acknowledgements require deeper exploration, self-reflection, particularly how we are personally connected to the land and what our responsibilities are as a result. For instance, I personally situate myself on this land as a settler of primarily European ancestry. As such, I have come to recognize the ways that I've benefited and been complicit in the violent colonial project on this land. This is a violence that persists today here and around the world. Settler colonial ideologies not only continue to impact Indigenous peoples and communities, but also the land itself through continued environmental destruction. So at the same time, it is essential to recognize and support the resistance of Indigenous peoples at the front lines of defending their land, and to likewise work towards the goals of Indigenous sovereignty, land back, and liberation for all, through fostering especially of reciprocal caring relationships with one another and with the land. So considering this, we invite each person to reflect on how you would like to take up these responsibilities from your own spaces and your own positionalities. Thank you.
Thank you, Lois. That was wonderful. So today we are joined by Mskwaankwad Rice. He is a second language speaker, learner of Anishinaabemwin from the Waasaaksing First Nation. He's a co-founder of the Eshki-nishnaabemjig immersion program and has worked on language initiatives in his home community, such as on-air and online audio and video lessons for the CHRZ Rez 91 and elsewhere in Ojibwe country. Mskwaankwad is currently undertaking a PhD in linguistics in the University of Minnesota, and he seeks to apply his knowledge of linguistics to Nishnaabemwin and Ojibwe reclamation efforts in order to better serve the movement as a whole. So have the wonderful presentation, and yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thanks for the introduction. Good work on the pronunciation, Megan. I know you last minute and you had to jump in there. You did great. So yeah, I'm Mskwaankwad. Thanks for having me. I'm just gonna share my screen and jump right into the presentation because that will be kind of like my introduction. Yeah, I always have to juggle windows. It's always so awkward presenting on Zoom. Yeah, before COVID, I got actually good at presenting in person and then had to do Zoom presentations, and I never quite got the hang of it. But anyways, this presentation is called Ezhi-nanda-gikendamaan, gidinwewininaan. That means basically the way in which I try to learn our language. So I'm just going to talk about who I am, why I started, how I learned, what I do now, and what use can do. I use because the plural second person is a thing in Ojibwe, and you'll notice that a lot of Native people say use, even though it's so-called in proper English, but there's no such thing as proper English. And it's, yeah, if you say use in your dialect, please go ahead and do so. So yeah, this talk, I'm just going to talk about my language journey. I'm going to focus on how I learned the language and get into some specifics about like the actual courses I took and strategies I employed in excuse me, in learning the language. Hopefully to give people an insight into what they can do if they are language learners. I find for myself it's really helpful to learn from other learners, like how they have learned. But also I hope it's helpful for you people in the audience, be you educators or whatever you do in your work and life. I think, yeah, for an educator, it might provide some insight into what is needed in terms of resources and support for native language learners. So a couple preliminary things. I'm talking a lot about learning as a second language learner, an adult second language learner, because that's how I learned Nishnaabemwin. But Nishnaabemwin or the Ojibwe language, I'll use those terms interchangeably. And I'll say the best way to learn is as a child, as a first language. Unfortunately, that opportunity is not available for a lot of our people in Anishinaabe in Ojibwe country, just because of the reality on the ground of the state of our language. So I'm talking about learning as a second language, but ideally what we want to do is teach our kids, teach the kids our language as a first language, and that's what would be best. But for now, today, I'm talking about learning as a second language. There are also teachings around the language. It is a spiritual language and it relates very strongly to our people, our culture, and our spirituality. So I want to recognize that as well. I also want to note that the subject itself can be difficult to talk to because there's a lot of a lot of baggage tied to it, considering the fact that, you know, settler government tried to do away with our people and our cultures and languages, and we're still dealing with that, especially for those people who, you know, went away to residential school and, you know, their descendants, the intergenerational trauma carried by that. So talking about language can be really tough. So I just wanted to mention that. I'm not actually going to focus on those things today, but I wanted to mention that because for us, for our people, excuse me, it can be hard just to talk about the language. So wanted to mention that. And going on, then Nishnaabemwin. I don't speak Ojibwe very good. I don't speak the language great, so I want to make that disclaimer. If there happen to be first speakers in the audience, please go ahead and correct me. I like being corrected. And I also want to note that I'm from a specific region. I'm from Waasaaksing. We speak Nishnabemwin, our particular dialect. I'm currently out in the more western end of Ojibwe country, and they speak a bit differently here. So at least in the written slides, I've tried to adopt a more universal Ojibwe. Yeah, so I just want to make that note. And I have many people to recognize. I wish I wish I had the time to do so, but like the teachers and fellow learners and other people who have been important to me on my language journey, I just want to make note of them. But there are many of them, so too many to recognize right now. Oh, me, Eyawayan, this is who I am. Again, Waasaaksing Donjaba, I'm from Waasaaksing. Mskwaankwad Dodem, Bear Clan, and then Ezhi-nanda-gikendamaan, Gago and gidinwewininaan, gidinwewininaan. So I'm trying to learn. I'm a learner of Ojibwe. I didn't speak as a child. I'm going to school right now at the University of Minnesota. That's where I am right now in Minneapolis. And I'm doing a PhD in linguistics, and I'll talk about why I got into that. So yeah, this is a picture of Waasaaksing, this island here. That small town next to it is Parry Sound, Ontario, and my brother took this picture on a plane ride from, I think he's going from Toronto to Sudbury or something like that, and managed to get a really cool picture of our res from the plane. So it's pretty cool there. Yeah, I also wanted to mention I didn't speak the language here. I don't. So I didn't speak the language as a kid because my mom is Euro-Canadian settler, so she never knew the language. My dad spoke the language as a kid, but he went to day school and language was discouraged. And yeah, that's a whole story in itself. He understands everything and he can speak sometimes, but he has a really hard time with it, and that's because of the things he went through with his language. So growing up, I didn't speak it in the home. We spoke mostly English. I knew a bunch of words, but yeah, English was the language I spoke mainly as a kid. Gidinwewininaan, these are people I remember. Manado, the spirit of the language. One of my teachers, well, many of my teachers tell us to respect our language, respect the spirit of the language. And you know, especially for those of us as learners, when we respect that spirit and support it, like we are supported ourselves in our learning. Anishinaabemwin, also respect and remember the speakers, the language speakers I work with and who help us learners. Those who passed on, especially our ancestors who spoke the language and carried it on so that we can have it today. My grandmother, she was one of my first teachers and a very important person to me, regardless outside of my language learning as a child. She was a very big part of our lives. And this is my gram right there. That's my dad's mom, my late grandma right there. So I miss her a lot, but thankfully I got to learn a lot from her while she was around, and I still have those things to look back on. How I started or why I started learning the language. Like I said, I didn't speak it as a kid, but I knew a bunch of words. We did have language classes in elementary school, and this is kind of the norm for a lot of people my age, or at least people who grew up on the res. We would have language class in elementary school, but it was only a short amount of time in the day or week and not enough to actually learn how to speak the language. That being said, I learned a lot of nouns. I know, I know how to say a lot of nouns in the language, especially animals, numbers, colors, things like that. The things that you teach kids in like elementary language classes. But that being said, we didn't learn how to actually speak the language because it wasn't enough time, wasn't enough exposure to it. That said, I did hear the language in the community and my family. My grandmother and her siblings, they all spoke the language. And that generation, they all spoke the language. So even when I was a kid, which was kind of a long time ago now, at community events, you'd hear the language. The older folks spoke it all the time, and that was really good. So I'm glad I did have that exposure to it. As I became a youth, as I got older, even into high school, we had Ojibwe language, but it was still more of the same, like not enough to actually speak the language. And you see a parallel with with non-native students who went through our education system, went through the mainstream education system in regards to French. Like most kids, most young adults, they have French class all through school, but they still don't know how to speak it. Like it's not enough to really get someone to the level of speaking. And it was at this time when I was a young person that I started to think about the importance of the language. I noticed that my gram was the only speaker left in my immediate family. And so the seeds were planted there. I started to think, once Graham is gone, no one will speak the language anymore. And so it was a long time before I really did anything about it, but it was around that time that I started to have an interest in the language and kind of start to think more of its importance. So Gane Natalagian, as I grew up, it still took a long time for me to make the effort to learn the language. And I think a part of this is because I didn't see it as an option. It wasn't something that was encouraged or promoted at that time. I think that things are better these days. Like young people will, see that they can take their language in post-secondary studies, which is really good but for me at the time that I know there were programs going on, but I was not aware of them. I did not know they weren't really presented as an option. So yeah, I didn't really make make the effort to learn. Then mi des good simdana dasal gizian. It was around when I was around 30 years old that I started to learn. And Ezhi-nanda-gikendamaan, this is how I tried to learn how I started. So like I said, I had a base vocabulary and my pronunciation was decent because I had learned those words as a kid. So I pronounced them okay. Yeah, so my pronunciation is okay. It's definitely not great. I've done exercises in classes where we record ourselves and listen back, and it's like when you do that sort of thing, it's essential for language learning, no matter what language you're doing. But it's very, yeah, I don't know, it's very revealing. But it's a good thing to do. It's a good practice if you want to speak better. So it was around 2010 when I really started making some real concrete efforts and actions to learn the language. I was living in Ottawa. I did an undergrad there at the University of Ottawa, and then I just stayed there and lived there for quite some time. And yeah, I was living there, but still visited home quite a bit. And so what I would do is keep a small notebook of words and phrases I wanted to learn how to say, not just words, but also phrases, like more complex sentences. And so I would keep a notebook, write those down, and anytime I'd visit home, I'd sit down with my grandma, use my phone to record us, and then just sit there with my list and say, how do you say this? How do you say that? And she would say it back. So then I would take those files of those audio files and edit them and into small little clips, small little MP3s, and I listened to those on my iPod. Remember iPods? I listened to them on that as I walked to and from work. So it was about half an hour each way. So that way I had like an hour a day of vocabulary memorization. So yeah, that was really helpful for building vocabulary, but also it was it was good practice to put the time in to hear the language more than I had previously. And yeah, that was something I started to do. And then I can't remember what year it was, but it was around this time that I took a course at Carleton University taught by Jean Akwenzi of Eshki-nishnaabemjig, Cape Croker. There was, yeah, an introductory Ojibwe language class offered by the university, which was also open to community members. So you can I wasn't attending university there, so I just put in an application. Myself, my brother, some other friends of ours, all took that class. And it was really, really good. It was essential. It was I feel like one of the big first steps in my learning because I learned the structure of the language. I learned how to actually say a sentence because before then I just really only knew words. The only sentences I knew were just memorized, like Anishinaabemwin, Mskwaankwad Rice, just basic introduction stuff. I could say those, but I didn't really understand them. So this class was super essential, and it was necessary because I was not able to figure out that technical grammar stuff on my own, even though I did try. I'd sit with my grandma and I would ask her how to say certain things, and I would say okay, why do you say it this way? And she'd say, that's just the way you say it. And I would ask her about other things. We wouldn't really get very far because, yeah, I don't know. It's all languages are very complex. And as a speaker of a language, just because you know the language doesn't mean you know how it works. So yeah, the class was really good for helping me get started learning grammar and structure of the language. So what next? I had a little base, a base knowledge of the language. I could make a simple sentence now, like nagigo ke, and I understood that the ne on the front of nagigo ke is the part that relates to me, the first person me. And I could also make a sentence in the past tense, gigigo ke. So the gi part relating to the past tense. But I still couldn't make a complex sentence, something like I'm happy when I'm fishing. I would say something like ngitchinandum, because that was something I knew how to say. I am happy. And I could throw that word P in there, which is like when. I would say ngitchinandum P nagigo ke. But that's not right. That's ungrammatical. And I didn't understand why. And yeah, I'll get into a little bit of the grammar, technical grammar in a minute. But so yeah, I could say simple things, but not much further than that. So yeah, I couldn't I needed more. I needed to learn more to get to a place where I could like make myself understood. So a big turning point for me was getting these Nishnaabemwin course books written by Marianne Corbier, who's a very wonderful teacher. I still work with her all the time. She does so much for our language. She had written these course books for her language course at the University of Sudbury, and they were super helpful. They explained the complex grammar stuff in a way that was accessible. So it was a really necessary step in my understanding how the language works. And I didn't actually take the course. I heard about the course, heard about these books, and went and bought them from the University of Sudbury to yeah, to use on my own. I just went through them on my own, and they're super helpful. Many other language learners that I know have the same experience. They use these books to really get their language to the next level. The course is currently with the Kenjigewinteg Educational Institute. So if anyone's able to, you know, access that and take that, I highly recommend it for, yeah, for language learning. Yeah, it was really good for me. So yeah, like I said, I explained these courses explain the necessary step in my learning in an accessible way. So I had resources. I've always had a lot of language resources, and if there's any other learners out there, they will recognize this. It's the Nishnaabemwin reference grammar written by Rand Valentine, who's a Jognosh linguist, super nice guy, did amazing work in making this grammar. So it's a grammar of the language, and it's, as you can see, it's huge. There's a ton of information in here. I use it all the time now. But that being said, at the time when I first got it, I didn't understand how to use it or even any of the words in this book because even though he tried to write it in an accessible way, linguistics as a discipline is not accessible to everyday people. Yeah, this section is on indefinite universal and negative pronouns. This is on the proximate and obviative. And so, yeah, those are like, as a learner, you don't know what that means, so it's not accessible. But yeah, I'm not talking trash. He's an awesome guy, and I love that he wrote this, and I use this book all the time. But yeah, the course books for Marianne was written in plain language and had a really good combination of lessons and exercise. So I could just work through that on my own, and yeah, it was super helpful for my learning. So now I was able to say I'm happy when I'm fishing in a way that was not in the proper way. I'd say gidinwewininaan on. So I've just highlighted the parts that are, you know, what is doing what in there. And I do want to take a little side note and talk about some grammar, just to give you all some specifics. And if there's other language learners in here, especially if you're a beginner, this can be helpful for you, just to give you an idea of what we're looking at with the grammar. So there's this thing, this grammatical thing in Ojibwe called verbal order. I put that in quotations because it's not about the order, sequential order of verbs. It's just like an order as a categorization. So yeah, it's how the verbs operate depending on the sentence they're in. It's hard for learners because English doesn't really have this. So in English, you would say, I am eating. You could also say I'm happy when I am eating, and those forms and conjugations are the same. I'm eating, I'm happy when I am eating. It's the same thing. So you just throw a bunch of words together, makes sense. Verb form is the same. In the Nishnaabemwin, it's different. So I want to say I'm eating, I would say nuisin, I am eating. But if I want to say I'm happy when I am eating, I would say gidinwewininaan. So the part that is indicating that it's me is completely different in those two sentences, those two clauses. And that's an essential part of Ojibwe grammar. The verbs act different. So I would notice this when I was trying to learn with my grandma. I would notice her using, I would recognize the verb, but it would sound different. I'd ask her what it means, and she'd say it means I'm eating. And I would say, well, what does nuisin mean? She'd say that means I'm eating. And I'm like, why are they different? And like, she's like, what are you talking about? And it was hard to, like I said, I couldn't figure that out. I couldn't figure out the technical grammar stuff. So yeah, this verbal order stuff. There's a few different orders in the language, and the first one I'll talk about is the independent order. As learners, we call this A form. I don't know who started naming these orders in different different terms like A form, B form, C form, but it's really helpful. It's helpful for learners to look at it that way. So the independent order of verb conjugation is used in independent clauses. So for example, nagigoke, I am fishing. And it's called independent because these clauses don't need support to make a complete sentence. It's a complete sentence on its own. I am fishing, doesn't need anything else. So the conjunct order, or what we call B form as learners, it's used in dependent or conjunct clauses, and in other cases, but I'll keep it simple because Ojibwe grammar is way too complicated. So in a dependent clause, I would say gigo-ke-on, when or that I am fishing. So because it's a dependent clause, the part that indicates me, I have to put this yon suffix on the end. And this order is called dependent. These clauses are called dependent because it depends on more info to make a complete sentence. So when I say when I am fishing or that I am fishing, that's not a complete sentence on its own. So it's a conjunct or dependent clause. And as you can see, the parts that indicate the first person, me, look completely different in those two sentences. So as an example, putting two together, gidinwewininaan, I am happy when I am fishing. That's the A form clause and the B form clause. Oops, I'll go back. So yeah, this, as you can see, it's quite complicated, and it was really hard for me to wrap my head around, even when it was spelled out for me in those course books from Marianne Corbière. But the way those are written, she's able to explain these complex things in ways that are like accessible to the learner. So that was really good. Now back to the language learning story. What next? So now I knew how to say things like I'm happy when I'm fishing. I had a good grasp on the basics of the grammar. But what next? Like if you want to speak a language, you have to actually speak the language. And that's really hard. It's really hard to do. For me, for myself, doing immersion was essential for this. Like I have to do it. I still try to keep up with immersion. So back in 2015, myself and a few other learner friends, we attended the Ojibwe Mskwaankwad Rice Language Learning Academy, Immersion Academy here in Minnesota. It's based out of the Fond du Lac Reservation. I first attended in 2015. They do summer sessions that are like a couple weeks at a time. You're there for the whole time. And in the winter, they do a winter cohort where you attend 1 weekend a month. And they do full immersion. Which is really good. It's really essential. Back when I first started learning, I would hear about immersion camps and immersion events, and I would go there and everyone would be speaking English. And I'm like, what is going on? We're supposed to be doing immersion here. So yeah, they do full immersion, and it's really hard to do. And it is really essential to do these things to create these environments where we can have, where we can fully immerse ourselves in the language, because sadly, the situation in the majority of our communities is that, yeah, we don't have that anymore. We don't have as many enough speakers to make our communities speak the language all the time. So anyways, yeah, I attended a few times. It was really hard my first time doing actual full immersion for, back then it was 3 weeks, 3 weeks at once. That was pretty rough. Yeah, but it really helped my learning. And I'm currently attending the winter session. We've got a weekend this coming weekend where we go meet just for the weekend and do immersion and have elders come visit and teach us things and stuff. And we have a really good time. This is an example of what you do at OOG. So this is myself, Zawagijgo-gidinwewininaan. There are two fellow language learners who I still work with to this day. We created our own immersion program based on OOG. So this shows us, I'm just posting this as an example of things you do in immersion. So what's going on here is you'll put on a little play or a little skit before dinner, explaining what we're gonna have for dinner. You'll see Mskwaankwad has got a picture of like chicken right there. And we have these puppets. And so we're clearly doing some sort of play with the three little pigs. We got 3 pigs there and a wolf. And it's really fun. It's kind of silly, but it's like a really fun example of the many things you can do in immersion. Yeah, just something like this, a fun little play. It really pushes your boundaries, your skills. Yeah, just to do fun little things like this. And something we continue to do. So today, I take classes when I can. I'm here at the University of Minnesota, and they have a really good Ojibwe language program. So I took those classes while I was doing my MA and into my coursework for my PhD. It's a really good program, and they offer them online as well. So I highly recommend them to any learners who might be here. Like I said, I'm currently doing the OOG winter session, and the work I do in linguistics is actually also helpful for my learning. Just some of the practical things I do helps me. So yeah, that's a quick overview of how I learned. There are other strategies that I didn't talk about, such as reading. I've got a few books in language. There's quite a few published. This is Sounding Thunder by Mskwaankwad Brian McGinnis, who is from my community, has stories in here in both English and Nishnaabemwin. I find those really helpful. I can read it in the language and see what I understand and what I don't. But yeah, there's a ton of resources, books like that. Recording yourself is a good way. Like I said, like I mentioned before, it's painful, but it's good. And teaching, I know I haven't done a lot of teaching myself, but for other learners, teaching can be a really good way of learning the language, because you kind of have to know it. You have to know it to teach it. So it kind of forces you to, to really learn. And immersion, especially if you're doing immersion classrooms with kids, you have to know how to say anything in the language, and that really pushes you. People I know who have done immersion, it's just like, even after a semester of teaching immersion, like, notice their language skills like really go up, and especially like just their fluency, because you're speaking it every day. And yeah, like the way I learned is only one way to learn. There's many other ways to get there, but I wanted to talk about that. So to summarize, there's 3 easy ways to speak the language. You learn words, you learn how the language works, and then you speak the language. Easy as that. Nishaagana, just kidding. It is as easy as that, but when it comes down to actually doing those things, it's really, really hard. But yeah, that is what has been essential for me in my learning, and other successful learners as well. Like that's the way we have found to speak the language. So I do want to touch on what I do now. Like I said, I'm a PhD student in linguistics at the University of Minnesota. And the reason I started studying linguistics is because I met other Anishinaabe linguists back, actually one of the first couple times I went to OOG, met these people who were Anishinaabe, who were learners of the language and who had studied linguistics. And I was really blown away by how they understood the language and how they were able to translate that to teaching us learners to identify, like, okay, see this little part on the verb conjugation, this is what indicates me or you or she, and like the interactions there. So that was when the seed was planted in my mind to study linguistics. Wasn't until a few years later that I actually did it, but I was like, yeah, I saw how linguistics can support our language, and vice versa. Like the work I do now also supports formal linguistics in the things I research and try to figure out in our language. And yeah, doing a PhD will hopefully allow me to continue to do language work for a living. Things are better these days, I would say, but back like 10 years ago when I was trying to work on language, there were not a lot of opportunities to work in language or to learn. And so like I was really scrounging to get by for work, like just trying to make a living while putting in the time to learn the language. So my actual research is what I would call a learner-centered approach to linguistics. So I investigate the things that are hard for learners. Yeah, so as learners, we all run into the same hurdles, the same stumbling blocks with like things we can't figure out. And yeah, I found that that's where I start with my linguistic investigations. It's like, okay, what is this verb suffix? Why is it hard for us to understand? Where do we see it? Everything like that. And yeah, that's how I do my work. It also involves language documentation and transcription. So I work with elders and record the language, document it, transcribe it, and that's really good to have that documented because a lot of our speakers are elderly and they're not going to be with us forever. So I feel it's important to document those things. And this photo here is myself and Mary Wemigwance working on a project we did a few years back, and I really love working with elders. That's my favorite part. Hanging out with them, laughing and recording stuff and trying to figure out the language. That's what I like to do. Excuse me. So as an example of my current research, there's a lot of times in the language where we don't know when to use the A form or B form or the conjunct or independent form of the verb, because even though that there's that generalization of when and where you use those verb conjugations, there are examples where, or there are many cases where a fluent speaker will use one or the other, or like use one for sure in one environment and use the other one in other environments. And it's kind of hard. It gets complicated. So as an example, there's this word we use, at least in my dialect and related dialects. Obdek is like, it means have to or must. In other dialects, like out here in Minnesota, people would use this word boch, and it can go with an A form or a B form verb. So on the left there, obdek gwinoki, that's an A form, and on the right is obdek jinokian, sorry. So yeah, on the left is an A form or independent, on the right is the B form or conjunct. And so the parts that I've highlighted are showing you that it's the second person, you, that is, the subject of that sentence. But as you can see, they both mean you have to work. But they're different. There's different verb conjugations, although they both mean you have to work. So what is the difference? Anina, like what the heck? What is going on there? So yeah, this is an example of like me noticing this and other learners too noticing this. It's like, okay, when we're using this word, how come it's this in one environment or this in the other environment? So to be specific, the A form version, obdek gwinoki wabang. So like you have to work maybe tomorrow. It's talking about a specific instance of working. Like you have to work tomorrow. You're on the schedule, you got to work tomorrow. Whereas in the conjunct or B form conjugation, saying obdek jinokian gejonyamian. So that's like you have to work to make money, for example. So one of the examples, actually, I was talking to Marianne about this a little while back. She told me that she gave me an example. It wasn't exactly this, but it was like the B form conjugation for example, parents telling, their teenage child to be like, you have to work. It's time for you to start working. You have to work. And it's just a general statement about life or the way things work. It's not a specific instance. So, yeah, even though both of those sentences mean you have to work, you use one conjugation over the other depending on the situation. So yeah, like I said, my research identifies these cases that are confusing to learners and use linguistic tools to figure them out and identify underlying patterns, and then translate this information for other learners. Because like I said, linguistics is, it's not accessible to normal people. You have to learn linguistics, learn this other language to be able to even access, for example, resources like this. And this isn't even bad. This is like pretty accessible. There's like technical theoretical linguistics papers are still hard for me to read because of the technical language and things like that. So yeah, but because I know that now, I can translate this information for other learners. I've given presentations on things that I study. For example, my MA research, I talked about it at Eshki-nishnaabemjig and Nishnaabemwin. So yeah, this video is one of those things. This is on the Eshki-nishnaabemjig YouTube channel. This is an example. This is the presentation I gave at Nishnaabemwin last year. Verbs just want to have bun, and bun is a verb suffix that is all over in the language. And as learners, we hear it all the time, but we can't figure out when and where to use it because it has many different uses. So my MA research focused on that, and I'm now hopefully able to translate that to other learners. Yeah, I also mentioned my work involves transcription and documentation. I use this transcription software, which I've got a screenshot of. It's pretty technical. It's not a very accessible program, but it's really good. There's a lot of things you can do with it. And I found for myself, even just transcribing the recordings I have with elders is really good for my learning and understanding. Just hearing it, having to hear it like over and over, it's really good. And it's also a good preservation tool, like having these recordings we can visit with our elders later on. And so, yeah, that's really good. This is a screenshot of that Elon transcription program. Yeah, you can see all sorts of different buttons everywhere, and it's real complicated, but it's a good tool. This is the older guy sitting there. This is Waasaaksing. He's from the Lax Reservation here in Minnesota. On the right, there's my buddy Dusty. He is also in the PhD program. He's Anishinaabe from La Corderay, Wisconsin. This was a few weeks back. We were doing some recordings with Joe. Joe is Waasaaksing, the elder there. That's his English name. So we get him to come down here. We pay him for his time, and we ask him various things in the in English, like how do you say that in the language, trying to figure out crazy stuff. And it's really fun, and we get to document the work. And yeah, Joe is a super awesome guy, really good speaker, and yeah, we just have a good time. And it's great that I get to do this work as part of my research. I also work with the Eshki-nishnaabemjig immersion program. I didn't do it last year because I'm too busy with PhD stuff right now, but myself and the two others in the photo a few slides back, we started this. We modeled it on Ojibwe Mortada or Oog. And so this is a 2-week immersion program that happens in the summer every year. I also do a podcast with Mskwaankwad, who was in that photo a while back, called The Language. And it's not a teaching podcast. We just talk about everything around Indigenous language reclamation. There's a lot of issues to deal with in trying to learn the language. We haven't had any, I don't remember when the last episode came out because we're both pretty busy, but there's some episodes there if people are interested. I'll just rip through this quick because we're running out of time, but I did want to mention that things people can do for the language. learners. Like I said, sharing our stories is good. So that's why I'm happy to share how I learned, because for me, hearing other people's stories is good. Not only just to like give me practical tips on how to learn, but also like it's inspiring. It's good to hear like, you know, someone else is going through the same struggles. And there are a ton of online resources these days compared to when I first started learning, which wasn't that long ago, but you know, there's tons of stuff online. You can do classes online. There's lots of videos. Yeah, and there's lots of online resources like Waking Up Ojibwe, the Midwest Indigenous Immersion Network, Nishnaabemwin at Home. Yeah, many others. So just like, yeah, just Google resources, language resources, you'll find a lot. For leadership, people in, you know, positions of leadership to support the language, support elders and the learners. Like the elders are an amazing resource, so they should be supported and like, you know, supported in many ways, like for example, paying them to, you know, come to events and help learners, and even learners too, like pay learners to learn the language. I know a couple people who are at the OOG session this year who I think they're from Red Cliff, Wisconsin, and their Rez is paying for them to work on the language, which you know, is a good example, good model, I think. And also documentation, creating community archive is something that's a good resource or a good thing to do. Oh, that says Mija Shanan, Dojo Niam, give us your money. Talking to the leaders. And for speakers, just speak. Help us who are trying to learn. Speak the language to us. Benishnaabemwin. Yeah, that's all we need those people to do. So me gonna much minik, maybe that's enough. Gidinwewininaan, gidinwewininaan. Do you have any questions? Yeah, that's it for me. Thanks for listening to me talk. Yeah, just blab away. So thank you.
That was absolutely a beautiful, beautiful presentation. Makes me so hopeful for the next generation of Indigenous people, especially with forgetting the language and the culture, that you're so passionate about bringing that language, connection to language back into the forefront. It's very important work, really, it is. So I'll throw it out to our participants here. Do you have any questions? Oh, I see. I see one from Melissa Miigwech. Can you talk a bit about the differences between Eastern and Southern Anishinaabemowin?
It's mainly, well, at least with Eastern Ojibwe and Southwestern Ojibwe, like here in Minnesota. The biggest difference between Eastern dialects and everywhere else is this vowel syncopation. So where they would say Anishinaabemowin, we say Nishnaabemwin. And that has to do with like stress patterns of the language. A lot of languages go through this process of vowel syncopation in unstressed vowels. So on the surface, they sound quite a bit differently. They sound quite a bit different. That being said, there are still very strong similarities grammatically, and even amongst all Ojibwe dialects, the grammar is pretty solid all across the board, which is really good. So that way, even if people are from different dialect areas, they can still understand what each other is saying, or at least figure it out, because the underlying grammar is pretty solid. But yeah, there's differences, definitely grammatical differences, and the biggest one between Eastern and other dialects is the vowel syncopation.
She clarified a little bit more specifically if you are learning at MN, I'm not sure, MN Southern, and working with elders at home Eastern.
Oh, yeah, I don't know. I feel like, yeah, even though it does sound quite a bit different, the underlying grammar is the same, but it is hard as a second language learner to, even though we can be familiar with different dialects, like myself, I'm familiar with my home dialect and working out here quite a bit with Minnesota Ojibwe. It is hard to speak, adapt to someone else's dialect. It just takes practice. So yeah, if you're learning learning out here and working at home, yeah, I don't know, just do your best to you know, to speak, and it might be a bit challenging, but you know, just power through it, and it might take some time to really, you know, put across what you're trying to say or understand what the other person is trying to say. But that's, you know, that's kind of how it goes as learners and as like you know, people who work in language. It's pretty tough. It's not as easy as you might think, but yeah, some things we just gotta power through.
Wonderful. Maureen, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you very much for that talk. It was really great to hear your story. I have a question for you as it relates to immersion. So it seems to me that immersion is a necessary step in order to create speakers. People talk about using, you know, immersive listening materials as a way to prepare for that, but I think ultimately you've got to get into a speaking environment. But here's the thing: it's rare, you know, and
Yeah.
I'm a bit familiar with what Eshki-nishnaabemjig, and by extension, I'm a little bit familiar with the methodology. It's awesome, beautiful, beautiful work you've done, and I feel a lot of gratitude towards that. But I'm wondering about, so in the next 10 years, like, what is a way to ramp up the spaces? And for me as a learner, I'm like 65, you know, and I feel like, oh, even to you know, ask for a space, it's sort of like I feel compromised in a way, because like I'm not the ideal learner from an age perspective. Like I've got a little bit of time left, I've got a lot of energy, but you know, I'm not going to be raising children, etc. So that's my question: what do you think in the next 10 years, or what are people in the domain thinking about ramping up immersion, and how to do that for all ages? If there's been conversations like that. I have a lot of other questions, but I know you only have a little bit of time.
Oh, Miigwech good, man. Thanks for asking. Yeah, that's the big question. That's a really tough thing. And as learners, we're trying to learn, and we need to get as many learners as on board as we can right now, so that we have that. I think Anton Troyer calls it like the critical mass of learners, where we can, you know, create environments where children are growing up speaking the language as a first language. So even though we do have a lot of people learning, and more people every day pick up the language, it's still really hard, because we're pretty scattered across, like Ojibwe country is huge, but because of, you know, the effects of colonization, I see it as like we're a diaspora in our homelands, because we're all in these little pockets of reserves and stuff like that. So that's something that's tough for us, just being physically just physically separated like that. And yeah, that's a big question, and I don't know the answer. And I think like it's going to take some I don't know, some big decisions, some a lot of effort from us as learners, because in order to create a language community, we have to physically have that community, and that might mean like everybody moves to one place. You know, we all congregate in specific places where we can, you know, talk the language together and like create a language community, bring up kids speaking the language and stuff like that. Yeah, it's really tough. I don't know how. Ideally, we wouldn't have to do anything like that, but you know, what resources would we need to create immersion environments everywhere? And sadly, you know, like the people just aren't there anymore. Like our first speakers, most communities only have a handful left. Like my community is in the same boat. So it's a really good question, really tough one, and I don't have an answer for you. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because it's really important. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just going to finish up then with one little suggestion, just something to think about, because I love your body of work. I love the direction of it, which is this idea of like, what do you do, like how to make this accessible for learners? That's an amazing body of work. That's a game changer as far as I'm concerned. And so the question then becomes how to create speaking communities in what forms can make that accessible. I think that's a real game changing question, and an incredible body of research could have come from that. I'll let that be then, Miigwech.
Oh, miigwech. I really appreciate that. Thanks for, yeah, that really makes me feel good to hear, because that's what I want to do, is support learners and like, yeah. So miigwech.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maureen. We'll move to Noah.
Hi there. Thanks for the talk. It was really fantastic to hear. I'm also learning Anishinaabemowin, so it was interesting to hear someone else's journey. I've got my little book here with the tags for C4, animated, transitive, inanimate, intransitive, and so forth. And my question is about right now, one of the struggles that I'm going through is that it feels like I'm always stuck in English first, like I'm translating from English. So when I say like Noah Indigenakas or Takaranto and Donjiba, like the idea in my head is like Noah, I am called. Like that's how I'm saying it in my head. Or Takaranto, I am from. And I'm wondering like if that's where you started too, and if so, how did you get out of that, like out of that mindset? Because I imagine that it's inhibiting my learning, like it's not something I want to stay with. And so I'm wondering if there was like a kind of process or a turning point for you where you recognized that, you know, you were finally kind of thinking in Anishinaabe rather than in English first, and then kind of porting it over.
That's a really good question. Thanks for that. And I wouldn't say that I have made that switch. Like, I still have English grammar patterns in my mind, and I still, in a lot of cases, find myself just translating from English because, like, that was the first language I spoke. So that's the base. I will say, just as you go along, it gets easier, it gets better. And I don't know specifically why that is. I think it's just as you get more used to using Ojibwe syntax, for example, like, you know, the word order there, the more and more you do it, the more and more I think you kind of, I guess, subconsciously become more familiar with how things are said in the language. But that's a really good question, and I don't know the specifics. It would be a really good area of research to figure out exactly, okay, what exactly is it about Ojibwe syntax that makes it different from English in a way that we can recognize, say we have a thought in our head before it's like in English, just this idea that we want to express, to understand how Ojibwe would express that without going to English first. And yeah, I don't know. That's a really complicated, that would be a really complicated topic, but I will say, just like over time, it comes to you, like the more and more you use Ojibwe grammar patterns, the more and more you use, I think going to first language speakers and resources from first language speakers that are in, you know, maybe not really influenced by English syntax or English grammar. Just the more and more you use those, the more and more you listen to them and read them and stuff like that, is really good. So thanks for the question. Also, I noticed that looked like a workbook from Ninatig, who is another fellow Ojibwe language.
Yes.
He's a really awesome teacher. Like I said, you learn from people who have learned themselves because they know the struggles. And he's like, yeah, I haven't taken his courses, but I just know him as a person and as a learner. So I know he's doing good work there. So yeah, it's good to see.
Wonderful. Do we have any more questions before we wrap up for today?
Oh, there's my cousin Maria.
Oh, cousin Maria.
Bonjour.
Well, then I do have a question.
Okay,
Go
so
ahead, go ahead.
put you on the spot there, just yeah.
Aside from the haircut, but I want to know what's next. Like, where will you take all of this? And maybe a second question, what's it going to take? Like, if you're dreaming.
Hmm.
Yeah.
For me, the immediate thing, so I'm like finishing my PhD here. I do go home to Waasaaksing in the summer and into the fall. So when I'm done this, I'm going to go back home again and just work on documentation for now while our speakers are still with us. Like my Auntie Audrey, she's the last speaker in my family. So I do a lot of work with her as it stands, but like I'm going to go home and work with the elders and speakers we have there, doing the documentation mainly. That's what I want to focus on. Because yeah, time is of the essence. So that's what I'm going to do immediately. After that, I don't know. Hopefully, keep working on this like linguistic investigation of the language to try and, you know, make it easier for us learners to understand. So that's where it stands. We'll see how things go. We never know what the future is going to look like. So yeah, good to see you. Thanks for coming in. Thanks for the question.
Wow, that's wonderful. All right, so that concludes our guest speaker series for this season. Oh my goodness. We're so happy to have you all come out and support the center and support the presenters as well. It's really meaningful to us. So I hope you have a great rest of your day. The sun's out in Toronto. Wonderful.
Miigwech,
Thank you,
Mskwaankwad.
everybody.
But
Have a good day.
so much. Amazing.